The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me. He has sent me to announce good news to the poor, to proclaim release for prisoners, and recovery of sight for the blind, to let the broken victims go free, and proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Yes, I opened this video with a quote from Jesus because, as we all know, he was the most radicalist leftist. Hello, kings, queens, and all in between. Welcome back to my channel where I do the research so you don't have to. That was a joke. You should still do your own research. I hope you're doing awesome, or at least better than the last time we spoke. Since I've been gone, I've been learning about a topic that's been on the minds of many for the past 100 or so years, and that is abolition. Yes, the time has come. As long as I've had this channel, I always knew that when I talked about abolition, it would be probably the most longest and detailed video I ever did. And judging by my 60-page script, for reference, the last video script was 20 pages. I was correct. But luckily for you, we love a challenge. The length is also why I'm laying down today. I'm gonna be here for a while, so might as well get as comfortable as possible. Full disclosure, abolition is a very complex topic and there's no singular correct way to pursue it, but there are a few incorrect ways we'll get into. We're gonna discuss a few common ways people go about abolition and also some criticisms and questions I had within my research, such as what is the history of abolition? Why or why not reform? And what will we do in a society without prisons with the rapists and the murderers? The Rittenhouses and the McMichaels, or as abolitionists call them, the dangerous few. This video isn't intended to be an argument for abolition, but rather a look at the discourse surrounding it and reform. More of a primer for those who are unfamiliar with abolition and looking to learn more. If you come away from this video thinking abolition is the way, that's fine. If you come away thinking reform is the way, that is also fine. My goal today is to expose those of you who aren't familiar to a healthy baseline understanding of both camps. Before all that though, if you're new here, hi, I am Philosynoir, formerly known as the Rented Minority, and I talk about things to do with blackness on an irregular schedule. If you're into that sort of thing, subscribe to the channel. I also have a Patreon which offers early access to all videos. Or if you really want to help out the channel, you can donate to my Buy Me a Coffee account, because this content is fueled by academic angst and caffeine. Like me. But alas, the time has come for me to present you with the best video on abolition, my magnum opus, the long-awaited prison abolition video. As always, all my sources are in the description, and I hope you enjoy. Part 1. How do we get here? A history of abolition. The substructured prison movements are gaining momentum. My trial is set for early August 1971. There'll be hearings in between, of course. If they're at all like the last, you could see my special bastardized style of martial arts. I'm working hard to stay informed. I wasn't at my best at the last showing. I'll clean them all next time they attack. A 10. Let me see your style. Your comrade in arms. He who does not fear the death of 1,000 cuts will dare unseat the emperor. George L. Jackson. When discussing a topic like this, I find it important to discuss the history behind it. And modern prison abolitionist thought, like past slavery abolitionist thought, finds its origins in rebellion. There are two very important prison uprisings that sparked modern abolitionist thought, and that is the Attica uprising and the Walpole uprising. And if you don't know about either of these, take a seat because it's a hell of a story. Let's start with Attica. On September 8, 1971, 2 men incarcerated in Attica were roughhousing in a yard at Attica prison. When they were ordered by correctional officers to stop, an altercation ensued involving a few of them and guards. Later in the day, 2 men were escorted by the guards to the infamous box in housing block Z. Now, the men incarcerated at Attica had heard rumors about this box, and stories about what happened to people taken there were not pretty. Stories of abuse, brutality, and torture circulated, and guards did very little to prove these wrong. So, turns out one of the men being taken to the box, Ray Lamoury, hadn't even been involved in the original incident. People saw Officer Strikeley Wardour, the other man, being escorted while taking him to the box. The next day, a correctional officer named Robert Curtis, who had been involved in the previous day's incident, was overpowered by a group of them in retaliation. And then things quickly spread to other cell blocks, with more than 1,200 of them congregating in cell block D. And this sparked one of the most well-known prison rebellions of the 20th century. Once they took over on Thursday, September 9, 1971, a committee of them drew up 5 demands as preconditions to end the takeover, and these 5 demands will be later brought into 15 practical proposals. And this is where things get interesting. The very first day that they seized control of Attica, the FBI started sending memos to basically everybody and their mama. The Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, the CIA, the Attorney General, the Vice President, and even President Nixon himself, which seems like a tad bit of an overreaction, but racists love overreacting to things black people do, so it tracks. Hearing Nixon was involved should be enough to foreshadow that things were going to be very civil and very legal. Nixon's involvement was weird to say the least, because this was a small town and small prison. But the instant there is a conflict there, the FBI and all other branches of the military are all over it, which shows Prisons in this country matter, and when incarcerated people protest, authorities find it incredibly disruptive. So, negotiations began. Leaders of the uprising put together a list of demands including improved living conditions, more religious freedom, and an end to censorship and expanded phone privileges. They also called for specific individuals such as the U.S. Representative Herman Badillo and New York Times columnist Tom Wicker to serve as negotiators and civil observers. Meanwhile, hundreds of state troopers were at Attica, and Governor Rockefeller had called National Guard. America State called in a National Guard on black folk. Intense negotiations, New York Correction Commissioner Russell Oswald agreed to honor the inmates' demands for improved living conditions. However, talks bogged down when the incarcerated men called for amnesty for everyone in the D-Yard, along with safe passage to a non-imperialist country for anyone who desired it. And Oswald didn't want to do that, or really anything. What's funny, and by funny I mean deeply disappointing, is this wasn't their first time interacting with Oswald asking for help. This incident, like most things, didn't occur in a vacuum. It had just been the last straw. Months before this, things were bad enough for some of them to create the Attica Liberation faction, which for months had already been making demands that were being ignored. They had even done some peaceful protests. The five founders were Frank Lott, Donald Noble, Carl Jones, Herbert Blyden, and Peter Butler. Carl Jones suggested that the Attica Liberation faction was founded to bring about some change to the conditions of Attica. We started teaching political ideology to ourselves. We read Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, Malcolm X, Du Bois, Frederick Douglass, and a lot of others. We tried a reform program on ourselves first before we started making petitions and so forth. In July, just months before the uprising, they had already presented 27 demands to Oswald and Rockefeller. This list of demands was based on a Folsom Prisoners Manifesto, which had been crafted by a man incarcerated at a Chicago prison in support of the November 1970 prisoner strike in California. Carl Jones offered this description of the manifesto and the motivations behind it. We wanted to do things, let's say diplomatically. We were seeking reform, although many of us were not in favor of reform, because they didn't believe that the people would listen. One of us would go to the different blocks and we would set up educational programs and bring to their attention what the manifesto was going on about. And they got a lot of support on this, although not everyone was in favor of signing it, so the five of them did. Oswald did not act on the demands. Instead, the warden of Attica, Vincent Marcucci, what was that? Responded by increasing the frequency of cell searches, censoring all references to prison conditions from news sources, and announcing that there would be no prizes awarded to the winners of the upcoming Labor Day sporting competitions. Just such a nice guy. Donald Noble explains what the prisoners hope to accomplish through the manifesto as well. Well, I'm one of the men whose name was on the manifesto that was submitted to Oswald. We submitted a manifesto, 28 demands to Oswald in July. We also submitted one to Rockefeller, and we also submitted one to Shirley Chisholm. We also submitted one to After Eve, and different other legislative people and lawyers and so forth. You know, we got a beautiful reply back from Oswald. He acknowledged our letter and so forth, and he was enthused about the way the manifesto was drawn up, because this was more or less coincided with his ideas. And he said that he was all for these changes, but to give him some time. Where have we heard that one before? And everybody went along with him because a lot of us have been dealing with Oswald for years, coming back and forth while he's sitting on a parole board. Like, there was things that all he had to do was more or less get in touch with the warden here that would have gone into effect. And these things more or less didn't take place. He said he was going to look into things, but they would take time. He made a speech, but the speech he made, a lot of people didn't like it because he talked about long range things. But people wanted to know what he was going to do about the problem. What is this here? So things were getting tense, to say the least, and they were only getting tenser. And when George Jackson was killed by correctional officers in San Quentin prison in August 1971, his killing sparked protests, including work stoppages at prisons across the U.S. Donald Noble explains it like this. What really solidified things was George Jackson's death. This had a reaction on the people, one that we were trying to accomplish all along, to bring people together. We decided that we would have a silent fast that whole day in honor of him. And they thought if people could come together for this, then they would surely come together for other things. George L. Jackson was also an inspiration for a modern abolitionist thought, and he wrote about his experiences in prison in his book Blood on My Eye. Jackson was a black radical in the 70s, so you know the correctional officers just absolutely adored him. On August 21st, 1971, George Jackson was killed by correctional officers at San Quentin prison. They contended that they shot him as he was trying to escape, but no one believes this. Frank Smith describes the morning after Jackson's death. I didn't know anything about George Jackson, so when we got to the mess hall that morning, everything was quiet. No one was saying nothing. You're talking about 500, 600, 700 people. There are young correction officers who found themselves in a mess hall with 7 silent, fasting inmates wearing black armbands. The silence and the mood of unreserved hostility was the most threatening and frightening experience in their memory. I was scared shitless, one young officer later recalled. And this wasn't the only demonstration. On August 30th, 300 of them signed up for sick call to dramatize the poor conditions of the health facilities. And on September 2nd, just a week before the rebellion, Commissioner Oswald had visited Attica to briefly meet with Frank Lott. He leaves early due to his wife's illness, but he left this message for the prisoners. I assure you that changes will be made, while also asking for more time to implement these changes. So frustrations were building, obviously, and this led to the uprising. So as I said, September 9th is when they took over the prison, and September 13th is when the rebellion ended with massacre. At 9:46, helicopters flew over the yard, dropping tear gas as state police and correctional officers stormed in with guns blazing. Most of them were shot in the initial gun down, but a lot were shot after they surrendered. An emergency medical technician recalled seeing a wounded prisoner lying on the ground, shot several times in the head by a state trooper. Another prisoner was shot 7 times and in order to crawl along the ground. When he didn't move fast enough, an officer kicked him. Many others were savagely beaten. Outside of Attica in the Blade Raid, authorities said inmates had killed and slain the hostages by slitting their throats. One hostage was said to have been castrated. However, autopsies showed that all 10 hostages were killed by gunfire. They didn't have guns, and this fabrication was obviously an attempt to villainize and discredit them. You may be wondering, why the fuck was this handled this way? And Nixon's tapes give some clarity. Nixon said Governor Rockefeller was worried about Attica because the word is around that this is a signal for the black uprising. And if there is anything I've learned, is that America absolutely cannot stand black people uprising. At the time, state government officials spread misinformation about Attica in order to justify the massacre. They said they had given the prisoners an ultimatum to surrender, that the prisoners who were mostly black had castrated white hostages, and that the prisoners had killed hostages during the retaking of Attica. None of the statements were true. In reality, law enforcement killed the 10 hostages, along with 29 prisoners as they raided the prison. The false statements about Attica shaped how people viewed that rebellion in particular and how people viewed prison activism in general. When the Attica rebellion started, people were sympathetic. And after all the misinformation came out, people were looking at them like they were animals. American media villainizing a just cause to lower public support? That's crazy. Where have I seen that before? So things aren't looking awesome, but don't worry, they get worse. Inside of Attica, things got very brutal. Frank Lott gives his experience about what happened after the prison was retaken. After the taking of the prison by the troops and guards, we were required to strip naked. We were herded over from the D block area barefooted. We were required to walk on the glass in the hallways, bleeding feet and all. That same night, they told me they had orders from Mancusi, the warden, for me to be removed. They took me to the D block area and held a gun to my head. They had me in a ditch and they asked if I was going to beg for my life. Naturally, I refused to say anything because I resigned myself to death because I knew these people were sick. It so happens just at that moment, another correctional officer called through the broken window in the hall and he told them to bring me back in. They say we're not up here for any kind of punishment and yet we have no desks, no stools, cold food, and things of that nature. You can't keep yourself clean. I worked in a metal shop 5 days a week as a spray painter. It gets pretty sweaty there. If I got caught bringing a towel into the shop other than shower day, they would lock me up. So, yikes. So following Attica, incarcerated people across the country were inspired to fight for change. Many of them raising the same concerns as those at Attica. And on September 7, about 200 incarcerated men at Walpole prison staged a day-long protest against the prison factories. Peter Gelderloos, certified anarchist homie, friend of the channel, who wrote the absolute banger of a book, How Nonviolence Protects the State, writes about Walpole in his book Anarchy Works. After the prison massacre at Attica in 1971 focused national attention on the dramatic failure of the prison system to correct or rehabilitate people convicted of crime, the governor of Massachusetts appointed a reformist commissioner to the Department of Corrections. Meanwhile, the inmates of Walpole State Prison had formed a prisoners' union. Their goals included protecting themselves from the guards, blocking the attempts of the prison administrators to institute behavioral modification programs, and organizing prisoner programs for education, empowerment, and healing. They also sought more visitation rights, work or volunteer assignments outside the prison, and the ability to earn money to send to their families. Ultimately, they had hoped to end recidivism and to abolish the prison system itself. Black prisoners had formed a Black Power education and cultural group to create unity and counter the racism of the white majority, and this proved instrumental in the formation of the Union in the face of repression from the guards. Leaders from all group of the prisoners brokered a general truce, which they guaranteed with the promise to kill any inmate who broke it. Well, the prison union was supported by many civil rights and religious activists. though communication between the two groups was sometimes hampered by the latter's service provider's mentality and orthodox commitment to nonviolence. It also helped that the correctional commissioner was in support of a prison union. So early on in the life of this prison union, they had already tried to divide them. The prison superintendent had put a lockdown on the black prisoners, while the white prisoners had already enjoyed their Christmas celebrations. The black prisoners, while preparing for Kwanzaa and family visitations, were put on a lockdown. And in an amazing display of solidarity, all the prisoners had went on strike, refusing to work or leave their cells. For months they suffered beatings, solitary confinement, starvation, denial of medical care, addiction to tranquilizers handed out by the guards, and disgusting conditions. But they refused to be broken or divided. Eventually the state had to negotiate, and they had won their first demands. The superintendent was forced to resign, and they quickly started to win more demands. Expanded visitation rights, self-organized programs reviewing release for those in segregation, and civilian observers inside the prison. In exchange, they cleaned up the prison and brought what the guards had never brought to the prison: peace. In protest of their loss of control, a lot of guards ended up quitting. They thought that them quitting would prove how necessary they are, kind of like how cops do slowdowns and don't respond to crimes to try to prove how necessary they are, but it kind of just proved a point that they weren't needed. For 2 months, the people incarcerated at Attica had run the prison. For much of that time, the guards were not present within the cell blocks, though the state police controlled the prison perimeters to prevent escapes. Civilian observers were inside the prison 24 hours a day, but they were trained not to intervene. Their role was to document the situation, talk with prisoners, and prevent violence from guards who would sometimes enter the prison. One observer recounted, "The atmosphere was so relaxed, not at all what I expected. I find that my own thinking has been so conditioned by society and the media. These men are not animals. They are not dangerous maniacs. I found my own fears were really groundless." Another observer insisted, "It is imperative that none of the personnel formerly in Block 9, a segregation block, ever return. It's worth paying them to retire. The guards are the security problem." Walpole had been one of the most violent prisons in the country, and when the incarcerated people there were in charge, rapes, recidivism, and murders fell to zero. That disproved two fundamental myths about the criminal justice system: that people who commit crimes should be isolated, and that they should be recipients of enforced rehabilitation, rather than being the ones who control their own healing. The guards were very eager to end this embarrassing attempt at prison abolition. The guards union was powerful enough to provoke a political crisis, and the corrections commissioner could not fire any of them, even those who had engaged in torture or made racist statements to the press. To keep his job, the commissioner had to bring the guards back into the prison, and eventually he sold out the prisoners. Major elements of the power structure, including police, guards, prosecutors, politicians, and media, opposed the prison reforms and made them impossible to achieve within democratic channels. Sound familiar? The civilian observers unanimously agreed that the guards had brought the violence back to Walpole, and they intentionally disrupted the peaceful results of the prison's self-organization. In the end, to crush the prisoners' union, the guards staged a riot and the state police were called in, shooting several prisoners and torturing key organizers. The most recognizable leader of the black prisoners only saved his life through armed self-defense. Many of the civilian observers and the correction commissioner, who was soon forced out of his job, ultimately came in favor of prison abolition. And Walpole and Attica weren't the only ones. Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, there was a strike against the prison factories. A prison in Atlanta, Georgia was also the scene of a protest against the Attica massacre and similar conditions prevailing there. At Wayne County Jail in Detroit, over 100 police armed with shotguns and tear gas surrounded the prison in anticipation of a rumored rebellion planned to protest Attica. At the women's prison in Alderson, West Virginia, 37 women, the more vocal and revolutionary types, as one prison official put it, rebelled against being transferred to maximum security prisons until they were subdued by pepper gas. And throughout New York, Rockefeller had insisted on tighter security on prisoners, but this didn't really help. At Clinton Prison, 250 incarcerated, some wearing black armbands, tried to march on a mess hall on September 15th, after hearing about Attica before being turned back by shotgun-carrying prison guards and state troopers. At Great Meadow Prison, about 75 rebelled for 3 hours on September 15th, throwing bottles and setting fires. At Elmira, about 200 staged a protest for several hours on September, chanting slogans and expressing solidarity with the Attica inmates. Attica and Walpole had been a catalyst for re-examining how many people were talking about prisons. Before this period, many activists were supporters of reform, but after, complete abolition started to look more appealing. And this still tracks today, with many attempts at reform falling flat, which we'll get into in a bit. We got a plethora of abolitionist literature, and many of them are now calling for abolition outside of the prison industrial complex. And with that, abolition often becomes a call for a change to society rather than a change to prisons. So with that being said, just what exactly do abolitionists want and how are they pursuing it? Part 2. Abolition, Reform, and a Dangerous View. So that was a bit of background on abolition, and it took way longer than expected. And this video is supposed to be out by January, but now it's looking like it's going to be out by the end of Black History Month. This video is going to be so fucking long. Oh my god. What if this is my first hour-long video? I'm happy to be sharing with you guys, those of you who made it this far. Shout out to you. So that was a little bit of a background about American abolition, and now we're going to talk about what abolition looks like in practice. So on the surface, it can look like abolitionists don't support any reforms and just want to let the blacks, criminals, walk our streets, but that isn't necessarily the case. Well, it kinda is, but hear me out. So following Attica, we got some of the most popular abolitionist thought that will go on to inspire modern abolitionist thought. Instead of Prisons, a handbook for abolitionists is one of these early abolitionist works. So is The Politics of Abolition, which would have been one of the sources for this video, but it costs money. Again, if you want to help out the channel, donate to my Buy Me a Coffee or subscribe to my Patreon. Instead of Prisons outlines 9 perspectives abolitionists may have, and we're going to talk about what all these may look like. Perspective 1. Imprisonment is morally reprehensible and indefensible and must be abolished. Abolition is a long-range goal, an ideal. The eradication of any oppressive system is not an easy task, but it is realizable, like the abolition of slavery or any other liberation, so long as there is will to engage and struggle. Abolitionists are against many reforms because instead of taking power away from the prison industrial complex, many reforms legitimize the damage it causes. And that pretty much summarizes the beef abolitionists have with reformers. Instead of working to improve the prison, abolitionists work to not need the prison and never want to rely on it. New Jim Crow explains how some reforms fall flat. As momentum builds for some kind of reform, I hope that we will consider carefully what counts as meaningful progress towards ending the history and cycle of caste systems in America. When most people describe the growing bipartisan consensus to end mass incarceration, they are typically defining the problem of mass incarceration in the narrowest terms possible, focusing only on reducing somewhat the number of people who are currently behind bars. As a result, celebrated reforms typically amount to little more than tinkering with the mass incarceration machine. We must not be seduced into believing that improving the system is the same as dismantling or transforming it. As Angela Davis has explained, if we accept uncritically the notion that prisons offer an answer, and that all we must do is improve our so-called justice systems, we evade the responsibility of seriously engaging with the problems of our society, especially those produced by racism and increasingly global capitalism. Our ultimate goal, if we're truly to aim to overcome our nation's habit of constructing enormous systems of racial and social control, cannot simply be to reduce the number of people behind bars. We must strive to create a nation in which caging people in mass, digitally or literally, and stripping them of basic civil and human rights for the rest of their lives is not only unnecessary, but unthinkable. And this isn't the direction many people who are making these decisions are going. Instead, we use prisons as the solution to the failures of capitalism, like housing insecurity and immigration. Take the drug policy under the Obama administration. Obama signed legislation that reduced the disparity between crack and coke, because we know those are the same drug. People celebrated when Obama granted clemency to about 2,000 people for drug offenses, but Obama also increased the number of deportations for drug offenses. According to the Human Rights Watch, between 2007 and 2012, post-conviction deportations for simple drug possession increased by 43%. In those years, roughly 260,000 non-citizens were evicted from the country for having been convicted of drug offenses, 34,000 of whom who had marijuana possession as their most serious conviction. Obama attempted to defend mass deportation by claiming that his administration was focused on deporting felons, not families, criminals, not children, gang members, not a mom who's working hard to provide for her kids. And this language that criminalizes incarcerated people and immigrants is pretty much the logic that fuels mass incarceration. Language is a big part of it, which brings me to abolitionist perspective 2. The message of abolition requires honest language and new definitions. Language is related to power. We do not permit those in power to control our vocabulary. Using system language to call prisoners inmates or punishment treatment denies prisoners the reality of their experience and makes us captives of the old system. Our own language and definitions empower us to define the prison realistically. So as I said, language is a big part of this, and system language is one of the main things abolitionists talk about. In Abolition Feminism Now, which came out conveniently during the scripting of this video, which added another 2 days to my scripting and reading, this video is going to be so fucking long. They're right. To generate wide-ranging conversations about the prison industrial complex, abolitionists borrowing from culturist Stuart Hill affected a disarticulation of crime and punishment. Popular discourse on the prison most frequently assumed that punishment existed in a casual relationship to crime, as implied by the phrase, "Don't do the crime if you can't do the time." Transforming public opinion regarding the reason for soaring numbers of people in prison required convincing enough people that crime was not the unqualified cause of punishment. This process of disarticulating crime and punishment created an opportunity to engage in the politics of rearticulation to counter the notion that prison was simply the appropriate sequel for the commission of crimes, with the recognition that there are many reasons people end up behind bars, and many needs experienced by those who were harmed. Central to the process of rearticulation was the recognition that race, gender, class, and sexuality were more important determinants of who goes to prison than simply commission of a crime. And in many activist circles, people are trying to change their language to, instead of referring to people as criminals, refer to them as criminalized. This abolitionist and feminist attention to language and power is reflected in Eddie Ellis's open letter to our friends on a question of language, published in 2007. And this letter pretty much just talks about how people talk about prisoners and people who commit crimes like they're animals, and asking them to stop. When we are not called mad dogs, animals, predators, offenders, and other derogatory terms, we are referred to as inmates, convicts, prisoners, and felons, all terms devoid of humanness, which identify us as things rather than us as people. These terms are accepted as the official language of the media, law enforcement, prison industrial complex, and public policy agents. However, they are no longer acceptable for us, and we are asking people to stop using them. In an effort to assist our transition from prison to our communities as responsible citizens and to create a more positive human image of ourselves, we are asking everyone to stop using these negative terms and to simply refer to us as people. People who are currently or formerly incarcerated, people on parole, people recently released from prison, people in prison, people with criminal convictions, but people. The use of system language is also expanded upon in the paper Amnesty or Abolition by Kelly Little Hernandez. This essay basically explores the historical development and the creation of the illegal immigrant in the American culture. The essay explores the historical development of the alienation of citizen offenders and the criminalization of immigrants in the United States. In particular, it chronicles how immigration control and mass incarceration emerged as systems of social control that frame alienated citizens and criminalized immigrants as a racialized cast of outsiders in the United States today. So kind of similar to how super predator narratives were used to control how people viewed black men back then, actually, and now. In numerous articles and television interviews, Princeton professor John DeLillo Jr. predicted that a new generation of street criminals is upon us, the youngest, biggest, baddest generation any society has ever known. Any society, y'all. America is now home to the thickening ranks of juvenile super predators, radically repulsive, brutally remorseless youngsters, including ever more preteen boys who murder, assault, rape, rob, burglarize, deal deadly drugs, and join gun-toting gangs and create serious communal disorders. And he wasn't alone in promoting this demographic theory. A lot of Republicans were using this theory to get a reputation of being tough on crime. Essentially, system language is tapping into that fear of the other by affirming that they are dangerous or violent or un-American to justify stripping them of their rights. The system of mass incarceration created a legal framework by which the rights and benefits of citizenship are routinely stripped away from millions of U.S. citizens labeled as criminals and felons, until they mirror, and at times dip below, those of non-citizen immigrants within the United States. This development has coincided with the criminalization of immigration in the United States, resulting in a new class of illegal immigrants and aliens who are viewed and treated as criminals. Immigration violations that were once treated as minor civil infractions are now crimes. They snap right here. I love this part. Perhaps most Americans believe their ancestors arrived legally in the United States, not me. But few today are aware that Congress left immigration almost unregulated for almost a century after the Revolution. And during that time, practically anyone who reached the American shores could enter America and work. Immigration control didn't begin until about 150 years ago during the U.S. Civil War. About a year into the Civil War, Northern congressmen found out about a plot that the South had to keep their slaves again. The South is always conspiring to keep slaves. So we know how the South loves cheap labor. Being all nervous about the Emancipation Proclamation, they quietly began to import Chinese contract workers. And the idea basically was to use these Chinese contract workers to replace the lack of slave labor they were going to have. And when Congress heard about this, they passed the Anti-Coolie Act of 1862. Which prohibited citizens from importing these workers to the United States. As to prevent the reinvention of slavery in the American South, the Anti-Coolie Act of 1862 functioned as the nation's last slave trade act and its first immigration law. Keeping Chinese workers out of the country, Congress reasoned, would prevent the creation of a new form of unfree labor in the United States. And yet, even as they considered additional protective measures, Frederick Douglass clapped back, saying that this would just reintroduce the slave problem. It was not the Ethiopian as a man, but the Ethiopian as a slave and a coveted article of merchandise that gave us trouble. The problem with slavery, in other words, was not rooted in the bodies of enslaved persons, but rather in the laws that organize inequitable social relations and protect the marginalization of humans. But of course, Congress didn't listen and continued to pass laws that restricted immigration. Increasingly restrictive immigration legislation created the illegal alien as a marginalized political category in American life. And the creation of the illegal alien just unfolded more and more after the passing of this act. It started dramatically expanding the limitations on who could enter the United States. In 1882, Congress banned Chinese workers and all lunatics, idiots, convicts, those liable to become public charges, and those suffering from contagious diseases. In 1885, all contract workers were prohibited from entering. In 1891, polygamists. In 1903, anarchists, gang, beggars, epileptics. In 1907, Congress also excluded imbeciles, feeble-minded persons, unaccompanied minors, those with tuberculosis, and women of immoral purposes. Whatever that means. And that same year, the president signed a gentleman's agreement with Japan that strictly regulated and limited Japanese immigration to the United States. By 1924, Congress had categorically prohibited all persons of Asian origin from entering and introduced a national origin system, which limited how many immigrants could enter the United States each year, but favored Western European immigrants. In effect, Congress had pretty much prohibited much of the world from entering the United States. The congressional project to restrict immigration thus took shape between the 1880s and 1920s. From northeastern manufacturing to southeastern agribusiness was rapidly becoming the world's most robust industrial economies. Despite numerical and categorical limitations, immigrant workers still arrived by the hundreds of thousands. Not all were qualified legally to enter the country. To evade immigration restrictions, they crossed the borders without inspection, used fraudulent documents to enter at ports of entry, overstayed visas, and violated conditions of legal residency. Immigration restrictions in the era of mass global migration, in other words, triggered the creation of illegal immigration as a new realm of social activity. As people from other countries stepped around the U.S. immigration restrictions, they stepped into the social political category of illegal alien. In a series of decisions made during the late 19th century, often referred to as the Chinese exclusion cases, the court established a framework for shaping the rights and statutes of unauthorized persons living in the United States. In Che Chang-ping versus the United States, the Supreme Court established that immigration control, the power of the exclusion of foreigners, being an incident of sovereignty, belonging to the government of the United States, cannot be granted away or restricted on behalf of anyone. The U.S. Supreme Court limited the reach of the Constitution and the scope of judicial review over the development of immigration law by defining it as a matter of sovereignty and thereby a zone of unmediated federal power. The 1893 Fang Yu Ting decision, the court held that the federal government's right to expel foreigners was absolute and unqualified. Therefore, immigrants, even lawful permanent residents, could be deported from the country at any time for any reason. This decision also established that deportation is not a punishment for a crime, but rather an administrative process of returning immigrants to the place where they belong. Defining deportations as an administrative process was highly significant because much of the Bill of Rights applies only to criminal punishment. According to the court held in Fang Yu Ting, the provisions of the Constitution securing the right of trial by jury and prohibiting unreasonable search and seizures and cruel and unusual punishment have no application. In these two decisions, the foundation for the illegal alien was made. For the first time since slavery, an entire category of people in the United States could be imprisoned without trial by jury. And the new Jim Crow basically points out how the language we use to justify mass deportations is pretty much the same type of language we use to justify mass incarceration. Just as the public was initially led to believe that the war on drugs was focused on drug kingpins or violent offenders, when the opposite was true, our nation's current war on immigrants has been advertised as a necessary to rid us of terrorists, gang members, or violent criminals, when in fact the majority of immigrants detained and deported have no criminal record and pose no threat. And the New York Times found in 2014 that 2/3 of the immigrants that were deported during the Obama administration had minor infractions or no criminal record at all, and only 20% of them were convicted of more serious crimes or drug offenses. 2 years later, the Marshall Project reported that the data remained largely unchanged. Anyone who had illegally entered the country after 2014 was considered a priority. Immigrants with only misdemeanors on their record were still relatively high on the list. Anyone with an aggravated felony was deemed a number one priority. But the extremely broad definition under immigration law includes people whose crimes are neither aggravated nor a felony. The term can apply to convictions such as shoplifting, drug possession, and low-level crimes that carry little or no jail time. Overall, the data revealed that the people deported mostly during the Obama administration had no criminal record or little to no criminal record. About roughly 60% of those deported had no criminal record at all. Perspective 3. Abolitionists believe reconciliation, not punishment, is a proper response to criminal acts. Abolitionists advocate for the least amount of coercion and intervention in a person's life and give them full autonomy in their own healing. And this is a perfect place to discuss the dangerous view. So instead of incarceration, abolitionists often focus on decarceration or rehabilitation. And this is often done with a transformative justice or a restorative justice model in mind. But before getting into that, just who are the dangerous few? In Prison Abolition and Grounded Justice by Allegra McLeod, The idea of the dangerous few is expanded upon. Who and how many are the dangerous few? The answer to this question is by no means self-evident, but its complete and final resolution ought not to interfere with serious engagement with abolitionist analysis, given that there are many millions of the 135 American adults presently living under the criminal supervision who fall outside of any such small category that may exist. U.S. jails and to a lesser extent U.S. prisons house numerous people who have never committed acts of violence or perpetrated serious harms against others at all. Decarceration, as it relates to this population, is less controversial, as there are many thousands of people incarcerated in this category that are plainly outside of any plausible definition of the dangerous few. Further, the category of the dangerous few is absolutely not reducible to those individuals who are presently incarcerated in state prisons after being convicted of violent crimes. Many people convicted of violent offenses right now haven't even committed crimes that are understood as violent by the general public. However, current enforcement patterns focus on certain forms of often racialized criminal threat and ignore all other forms of grave interpersonal harm. Many currently dangerous people who perpetrate vast economic harms or abuse the vulnerable too afraid to seek redress or wage unjust wars that kill many thousands will never face consequences. Instead of prisons also expands on this idea of dangerousness. The concept of labeling persons as dangerous assumes the ability to predict future behavior, which criminals are likely to commit future crimes of violence when released. Given a most remarkable void of reliable analysis, predictions of dangerousness cannot be trusted. For instance, a murderer, the typical image of a dangerous criminal, is highly unlikely to murder again. A dramatic illustration of the unreliability of labeling dangerousness is a result of the Backstrom versus Herald ruling. This U.S. Supreme Court decision involved 967 prisoners at Dannemora and Matta prisons in New York. These prisoners were persons normally considered among the most dangerous of all offenders, as they were classified as criminally insane. The effect of the ruling was to compel the state to release immediately or transfer to civil mental hospitals each of these allegedly dangerous insane criminals. A study of the aftermath of this mass release found that less than 2% of the released prisoners were returned to institutions for the criminally insane between 1966 and 1970. There was a remarkably low rate of violent behavior among those discharged. But this isn't to say we just need to lower sentences. Jail time, whether it be a year or 10, can still result in being treated as a second-class citizen. In regard to the control of the dangerous, there are no techniques for distinguishing which small number of a much larger class of individuals will continue to perform dangerous acts. Also, society has responded almost exclusively towards certain types of offenders, such as thieves, rapists, and murderers, but ignored almost completely large numbers of persons who are much more dangerous, such as those who make and profit from war, unsafe automobiles, and contaminating pesticides. Take the financial crisis of 2008. Employees at banks committed crimes including lying to investigators and regulators, fraudulently portraying junk assets as valuable assets, rate rigging, bribing foreign officials, submitting false documents, mortgage fraud, fraudulent home closures, financing drug cartels, orchestrating and enabling widespread tax evasion, and violating international sanctions. The massive criminality caused enormous harm. African Americans lost over half their wealth due to the collapse of the real estate markets and the financial crises. By the end of the crisis, in 2009, median household wealth for all Americans had declined by 27,000, leaving almost 44 million people in poverty. While some banks were eventually prosecuted, the individuals who committed these crimes were typically spared. Despite engaging in forms of criminality that destroyed the lives and wealth of millions, they were not rounded up, dragged away in handcuffs, placed in cages, and then stripped of their basic human and civil rights, or shipped to another country. A permanent prison banishment of the many convicted and restrained for the sake of safety from a possible few is not only morally outrageous, but is economically unfeasible. And as for the rapist, there are some abolitionist perspectives that address this without relying on a prison industrial complex. And what about the rapist's anarchistic approaches to crime and justice? This question is explored, and they put forward an accountability process that's based in transformative justice. Transformative justice opposes a punitive response to crime, and is in theory at least voluntary. However, transformative justice advocates have rightly accused restorative justice of being co-opted by the state, which undermines its potential to challenge structural inequalities. For instance, in the case of domestic violence, restorative justice, at best, restores both parties to the unequal positions they held before the abuse took place. And over the past decade, many activists have been experimenting with this accountability process. They ideally assume the following form. A person makes an allegation, a handful of people form a support group for that individual. The support group convenes a process and organizes a similar group for the perpetrator, who will be asked to broach the issue with this individual. The perpetrator agrees to participate in the process. The two groups gather in a session run by a neutral facilitator, during which both sides are given time to discuss their feelings. The perpetrator acknowledges the responsibility, and an agreement is reached on the steps they would take to repair the harm, such as informing future partners about what happened or attending counseling. And finally, the perpetrator abides by the agreement and is regularly checked in on by the support group, as is the survivor. These processes have unsurprisingly caused considerable conflict in many quarters, but could bear beautiful fruit if executed well. And it's already been experimented with. Take the Chrysalis Collective, for example. The Chrysalis Collective formed when a friend and a member of our community experienced acquaintance raped by another local activist. Diane was a woman of color involved in several local organizing projects. Through her activism, she befriended Tom, a white male grassroots organizer working full-time in a primarily poor people of color communities. As their friendship grew, Tom expressed his romantic interest. Diane made it clear to Tom that she was unavailable. A few months later, Diane felt that Tom betrayed their close friendship by manipulating her into sexual situations that she did not want. After several months of confusion and anxiety, Diane painfully realized that she had experienced acquaintance rape. Aware that the state and its prisons are the largest perpetrators of violence against our communities, Diane looked elsewhere for solutions. As infuriated and upset as she was with Tom, Diane knew that putting him in jail would not bring about the healing, justice, and peace that she wanted for herself, Tom, and the community. She gathered her close friends and formed the Chrysalis Collective. Though, they did include 10 pitfalls of this accountability process, which I thought were worth including. 2 important qualifications. First, these are pitfalls of the accountability process as they are actually practiced, as we have experienced them. Some of these pitfalls aren't inherent to the process, but are simply mistakes commonly made by people who undertake them. One might respond to many of these critiques by saying, well, if people actually applied the model as intended, that wouldn't happen. Fair enough. But for any such model to be widely relevant and applicable, it has to be robust enough to be able to succeed even when conditions aren't optimal, or when folks don't or can't follow the model perfectly. So bear in mind that these pitfalls do not imply that our accountability models are futile or doomed. On the contrary, because we're invested in figuring out how to end assault and abuse, we have to be unflinchingly critical in examining efforts to do so. Second, the things people frequently say to avoid responsibility should not be mistaken for problems with the accountability process. For example, this stuff distracts us from real revolutionary issues. It's divisive and hurts the movement. Holding people accountable is manipulative, coercive, over-empathize, a power grab, and so forth. These are not pitfalls of the accountability process. These are problems of the patriarchy and its supposedly anarchist apologists. That said, here are some of the major difficulties we have encountered throughout the process. 1. There's no clear sense of when it's over or what constitutes as a success or failure. When can we say definitely that a certain person has worked on their shit? What will allow a survivor and their supporters to feel comfortable with someone continuing to participate in the shared community? Expectations aren't explicit, goals aren't concrete, or the timeline and means of assessment aren't clear. Conclusion and frustration can follow for everyone involved. This often happens because we have so little experience with alternative modes of resolving conflict and addressing harm that we don't know what to look for. For instance, even if a person has been quote-unquote been accountable, the survivor may or may not necessarily feel better. Does this determine the success or the failure of the process? If someone has done all the things asked of them, but others aren't sure if these steps taken were effective, what could confirm a real change has taken place? It may or may not actually be possible to restore trust after harm has been done. If not, this may not be the right type of process to undertake. Likewise, past what point can we agree that someone has not worked on their shit and we shouldn't bother wasting our time anymore? Some accountability processes drag on for months and years, diverting collective energy from other more fulfilling and useful ends. 2. Standards for success are unrealistic. For instance, the common demand that someone work on a proverbial shit is either too vague to be meaningful, or practically translates to a profound psychological transformation beyond the bounds of what we can achieve. As the article Thinking Through Perpetrator Accountability puts it, perpetrator accountability is not an easy or short process. It takes a lifelong commitment to change behaviors that are so deeply ingrained. It requires consistent effort and support. When talking about follow-up, we should be making schedules for weeks, but also talking about checking in after months and years. It takes a kind of long-lasting support to make a real transformation possible. Let's be frank, if we expect people to remain involved in an accountability process for some scumbag they don't even like for years, and we expect this as a norm for an increasing number of processes for different people who may or may not be cooperative, we are not setting a realistic standard. 3. We lack the collective ability to realize many demands. We can say we are committed to meeting survivor demands, but that's just empty rhetoric when we require resources we don't have. Do we know suitably anti-authoritarian feminist counselors and therapy programs, and can we pay for them when a person called out can't? Can we enforce our wishes on someone who isn't cooperative? And as anarchists, should we? What consequences can we enact that actually matter? In transient subculture, can we realistically commit to following up with someone for years into the future and establishing structures of support and accountability that will last that long? One phrase commonly used in survivor demands and support discourse is a safe space. What does this safety mean? Is it something that we can promise? From reading the policies of recent anarchist gatherings, It appears that the primary method of securing a safe space involves excluding people who have harmed others. But safety means more than quartering those who have ruptured it for particular people, since rape culture and patriarchy suffice all lives. They're not just results of a few bad apples. While exclusion can shield survivors from the stress of sharing a space with people who have harmed them, and help protect folks in our community from repeatedly abusive people, exclusion falls painfully short of safety. In fact, we may rely on banning others from space less because it keeps people safe than because it's one of the only safety-related demands we can enforce. In the essay Safety is an Illusion, Augustus Celeste condemns the false promises of safe space. There is no such thing as a safe space under patriarchy or capitalism, in the light of all sexist, heteronormative, racist, classist, etc. domination that we live under. The more we try and pretend safety can exist at a community level, the more disappointed and betrayed our friends and lovers will be when they experience violence and do not get supported. What would genuine safety for survivors and all of us look like? Are there other strategies in the direction that we can enact beyond exclusion and ostracism? 4. We lack the skills in counseling, meditation, and conflict resolution. Often survivor demands include finding a counselor or a mediator. To be effective, this person should be willing to work for free or on a sliding scale, hold anti-authoritarian politics, and a survivor-conscious feminist analysis, have the time and energy to take an active role in working with someone over a long period of time, and be close enough to community to understand its norms without being directly involved in a situation. How many of these people are out there? How many of us even have basic active listening skills, let alone the ability to navigate complex dynamics of consent and assault, patriarchal conditioning, anti-authoritarian conflict resolution, and psychological transformation? And for those few who do fit the bill, or at least come close, how many aren't already swamped and overwhelmed? 5. This stuff depresses people and burns them out. It's intense, emotionally draining work to engage in community accountability, often with little appreciation or compensation. 6. The process sucks up time and energy. None of us signed up for anarchy because we love participating in exhausting processes to address stupid ways people hurt each other within our subcultural bubbles. We became anarchists because we hate cops, because we love punk shows, because we want a freer world, and for a million other reasons. When we spend so much time trying to resolve internal conflicts and convince cessors to take responsibility for changing their behavior, we risk cutting ourselves off from passions that brought us together in the first place. It's easy to get demoralized about anarchist politics when we can't even stop assaulting each other, let alone smash the state and abolish capitalism. It's not that working to end sexual assault and patriarchy is not revolutionary, on the contrary, but if accountability process, particularly unsuccessful and frustrating, one comes to occupy much of our collective energy, we're not likely to stay engaged and bring new folks into our struggles. We can't sweep assault and abuse under the rug and silence survivors in the name of false unity. This previous norm perpetrated oppression and made us less effective all around, promoting community accountability efforts to emerge in the first place. 7. Subcultural bonds are weak enough that people just drop out. When the primary consequence we can enact for non-compliance with accountability demands involves forms of ostracism and exclusion, people will avoid these by skipping town and dropping out. 8. Collective norms encourage and excuse unaccountable behavior. 9. The residue of the justice system taints our application of community accountability models. Previously anti-state militants often do miraculous turnarounds, suddenly becoming extremely interested in the US government's guarantees of justice. Whatever happened to innocent until proven guilty, man? Don't I get a fair trial? Can I defend myself? Listen to my character witness. On the other hand, folks pursuing accountability have received similar conditioning. 10. Sexual assault accountability language and methods are used in situations for which they were not intended. One example of this misapplication involves the widespread use of the principle of rape crisis survivor support, specifying that supporters should always believe the survivor. This makes perfect sense in a rape crisis organization setting, solely focused on providing emotional support and services to the individual who experienced a form of trauma that is widely disbelieved, when being believed is instrumental to the healing process. But this doesn't make any sense as a basis for conflict resolution. Transformative justice involves taking into account the needs and thus experiences and perspectives of all parties involved, including the person who was assaulted. This is dangerous not only because these terms and tactics were designed for certain types of conflicts and not others, but also because their overuse might trivialize them, the others to treat dismissively the very serious situations of assault and abuse for which they were developed. When this overuse of sexual assault accountability language dovetails with the identity politics around survivor and perpetrator and policies such as no perps allowed statement, this effort to promote accountability could end up discouraging people from speaking out against other forms of crummy behavior, for fear of someone being permanently tarred with the perp brush, rather than having a few conversations, apologizing, and reading his line. And all of these criticisms are great and valid, but what do? Well, they go on to provide an alternative example of what to do, and I'm not saying you should do this, but I thought it should be included. Jacob, onto this piece of shit rapist. We tried the accountability process that forces the survivor to put their reputation on the line as proof of their credibility, That ended up being an ineffective recreation of the judicial process that leaves the perpetrator scot-free, while the survivor has to live through this for the rest of their life. At the very least, the perpetrator should at least feel something, some lasting mark of his behavior, something that he will remember every time he has sex. That is, if he ever has sex again. So we decided to make sure that this is an assault that Jacob never fucking forgets. We rolled in with a baseball bat. We pulled the books off his shelf. He admitted it. Not a single one mentioned consent. We made him say it. I am a rapist. We left him crying in the dark on his bed. He will never feel safe there again. This is the precedent. This is the beginning of a new kind of accountability process, one that leaves the perpetrator in pain. Though, this is still only a tiny fraction of the pain that he caused. We know that Jacob is not the only guilty one. We know that there are more of you out there. We are not sorry and we will not stop. From now on, we respond to sexual violence with violence. If you touch me, I will fucking kill you. Let the roundups begin. Angela Davis gives her thoughts on the question, what about the murderers, at the end of her book, Are Prisons Obsolete? Instead of rehearsing numerous debates that have emerged over the last decades, including the most persistent question, what will happen to the murderers and rapists, I will conclude with a story from one of the most dramatic successes of experiments in reconciliation. I refer to the case of Amy Beale, the white scholar from Newport Beach, California, who was killed by young South African men. In 1993, when South Africa was on a cup of transition, Amy Beale was devoting a significant amount of her time as a foreign student to the working of rebuilding South Africa. On August 25th, Beale was driving several black friends home when a crowd of shouting anti-white slogans confronted her, and some stoned and stabbed her to death. 4 of the men participating in the attack were convicted and sentenced to 18 years in prison. In 1997, Linda and Peter Beale, Amy's mother and father, decided to support the amnesty petition the men presented to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. According to Peter Beale, we try to explain that sometimes it pays to shut up and listen to what other people have to say, to ask, why do these terrible things happen, instead of simply reacting? And Abolitionist Perspective 4, abolitionists work with prisoners but always remain non-members of the prison system. Perspective 5, abolitionists are allies of the incarcerated rather than traditional helpers. Take the FreeBresha and FreeMarissa campaigns, for example. And We Do This Till We Free Us, Maureen Cabot details activist work with helping victims of domestic violence who become victims of the prison system. And this is a larger percent of women in prison than many know. As many as 94% of the population in some women prisons have a history of being abused before being caged. Once being incarcerated, many cisgender, trans, and gender non-conforming people experience sexual violence from guards and others. Marissa and Brescia's freedom campaigns were inspired by their 1974 effort to free Joanne Little. The story of Joanne Little is very interesting. Defending herself against Clarence Algood, a white guard who was sexually assaulting her, Joanne Little grabbed an ice pick from his hand and stabbed him, eventually turning herself in to authorities a week later and claiming self-defense. She was charged with first-degree murder, which carried a possibility of the death penalty. Her plight soon inspired a mass defense campaign that became known as the Free Joanne Little movement. Organizations and individuals across the country raised money for her bond and her defense. When Little's trial began on July 15, 1975, 500 supporters rallied outside the Wake County Courthouse. According to historian Daniel McGuire, chants could be heard over the din of traffic and conversation. 1, 2, 3, Joanne must be set free. 4, 5, 6, power to the ice pick. Eventually, after a 5-week trial and 78 minutes of deliberation, Joanne Little was acquitted by a jury and returned to prison to serve time for her original offense, which was a break-in. And as I said earlier, Brescia and Marissa's campaigns were inspired by this. Brescia Meadows was 14 years old when she allegedly used a gun that her father had brandished for years against her and her family to shoot him in his sleep. Brescia had learned to fear her father, who had repeatedly made threats to kill her and her family. The evidence of her father's abuse could be seen in police reports, orders of protection, faded bruises, stories from neighbors, cries for help to school counselors, and rumors of sexual violence. On more than one occasion, Brescia escaped. Each time she was returned to her abusive home. The last time she ran to her aunt's home. Her aunt is a police officer, but she could not protect her niece. Instead, Brescia has been charged for murder. The state didn't protect her, and at the time the author wrote this, she had already been placed on suicide watch several times. The state of Ohio became Brescia's abuser. In late January 2017, Marissa Alexander was throwing off shackles to her ankle monitor after 2 years of house arrest and 3 years of mass incarceration before that. Marissa's journey through the criminal punishment system began in 2010 when she was confronted by her estranged husband in her home 9 days after giving birth to her third child. And she was being menaced by her ex-husband, who had admitted in disposition to being abusive to all his partners except one. Marissa had used a gun she was licensed to own to fire a warning shot to keep her abusive husband away. For this, a jury of her so-called peers found her guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon in a 12-minute deliberation. And a judge said Marissa could not invoke Florida's Stand Your Ground law because she didn't appear afraid. Brescia and Marissa, a black girl and a black woman, are part of a U.S. legacy of criminalizing survivors of violence for self-defense. Perspective 6. Abolitionists realize their empowerment of prisoners and ex-prisoners is crucial to prison system change. Most people have the potential to determine their own needs in terms of survival, resources, and programs. We support self-determination of prisoners and programs which place more power in the hands of those directly affected by the prison experience. Remember Walpole. Perspective 7. Abolitionists view power as available to each of us for challenging and abolishing the prison system, meaning that when reforms are proposed, the citizens have the power to accept or reject them. Take the situation at Rikers right now, for example. Rikers recently went on hunger strike.
Hi, this is Irvin Bowens. Listen, this is very important. Right now, my unit, we on hunger strike. We got over 9 meals. By the time you get this, we'll probably be on 11th to 12th meal. Is it possible you contact somebody from the media unit right away, and please contact the mayor's office right away. Let them know that we on hunger strike and we have a list of, reasonable, things that we would like to bring to the table so we can, get things rolling, such as law library and recreational and mental health service and medical and stuff like that we're not being afforded. The basic, mandatory minimum and standards that for a human being. So we on hunger strike. It's over 200 of us, and please, right away, is it possible that when you get this message, maybe you can post it on media and have your friends post it so we can get some type of attraction on this, and as well as all media contacts, right away. That's all I ask for is just a little help. Appreciate it. Thank you. And you have a blessed day, all right? Stay safe.
And this puts the ball on Eric Adams' court to decide what he's going to do. And he's doing such a great job. Adams has expressed support for solitary confinement, so if that tells you anything about how he's looking at it. And he's provided some ideas of reform which do not pass the abolitionist vibe check. These include the use of solitary confinement, fixing physical plant issues, and abandoning the practices of housing gang members by affiliation. Now, it's important to note that abolitionists aren't against all reforms, but the plan for Rikers, or at least one of the plans for Rikers that's being thrown around, is just building more prisons, and building more prisons is definitely not a reform abolitionists will support. In Abolition Feminism Now, they say this about reform. If prisons are overcrowded, ways should be found to cut back the mass criminal laws and types of enforcement that send so many people to prison. The construction of new prisons is not compatible with our view of the proper role of criminal law in a democratic society. An amalgam of economic, political, cultural, and representational forces produce this fatal normal. Politicians were winning elections by exploiting the notion of law and order and perverting definitions of safety. Media outlets were supporting these ideas for their own benefit, and corporations were profiting from the services to prisons and cheap prison labor. The field of prison architecture was expanding as the telephone companies were developing lucrative contracts with correctional agencies, and as the construction industry itself was thriving as a result of the many jails and prisons being built. Moreover, gender violence was increasingly conceptualized as just another crime to be addressed within a law and order framework by emerging victim rights movements supported by conservative legislators. The same conditions that were responsible for the economic racial issues that drove the prison boom in the U.S. were also responsible for ruining the local economies in the global South, and therefore driving increased migration. Immigrant detention facilities, many of them owned and operated by private prison companies, further consolidated strategies of what is now referred to as mass incarceration. Abolition's reorientation and revitalization as a philosophical and activist tradition in the context of intensifying state violence made it possible to understand that mere reforms would not make visible or eliminate any of these structural conditions. We Do This Till We Free Us gives us a pretty good abolitionist guideline for evaluating reforms. Are the proposed reforms allocating more money to the police? If yes, you should oppose them. Are the proposed reforms advocating for more police and policing? If yes, then you should oppose them. Are the proposed reforms primarily technology focused? If yes, then you should oppose them, because it means more money to the police. Said technology is more likely to be turned against the public than it is to be used against the cops. Police violence won't end through technological advances. Are the proposed reforms focused on individual dialogues with individual cops? And will these dialogues be funded with tax dollars? I am never against dialogue. It is good to talk with people. These conversations, however, should not be funded by taxpayer money. That money is better spent elsewhere. Additionally, violence is epidemic to U.S. policing itself. There are some nice individual people who work in police departments. I've met some of them. This is not a problem of individually terrible officers. Rather, it is a problem of a corrupt and oppressive policing, built on controlling and managing the marginalized while also protecting property. What reforms should you support though? Proposals and legislation to offer reparations to victims of police violence and their families, and this can look like the reparations gained in the Burge cases.
Thank you. Mr. Burge, would you state your full name and spell it for the record, please?
John, Jon, middle initial G as in George, Burge, B-U-R-G-E.
Okay. Now, during that 25 years, or 20 years of working with the Chicago Police Department, did you come across instances of police torture?
I will adopt my prior answer to the first question as my answer to that question.
Are you taking your Fifth Amendment rights?
That's correct, on advice of counsel.
And while in Vietnam, did you observe or participate in the use of electric shock against Vietnam POWs?
I'll adopt my initial response as the answer to that question.
And you take the Fifth Amendment.
That's correct.
And were you interrogating a suspect in Area 2 sometime in 1972 or 1973 when William Parker walked in and opened the door?
I'll adopt my initial response as the answer to that question.
You take the Fifth Amendment on that?
Yes, I do.
And were you beating the suspect that you were interrogating at the time Bill Parker walked in and opened the door?
I'll adopt my initial response as the answer to that question.
Now, are you taking the Fifth Amendment on that, sir?
Yes.
Did you use some kind of electrical device that generated electricity on Anthony Holmes to give him shocks when you were interrogating him?
I'll adopt my initial response as the answer to that question.
You taking the Fifth on that?
Yes.
And did you also repeatedly participate in putting a plastic bag or a typewriter cover over his head when you were interrogating him in May of 1973?
I'll adopt my initial response as the answer to that question.
You taking the Fifth?
Yes.
Early in 1982, did you participate in the electric shock and threatening with a gun and using racial epithets against a suspect by the name of Melvin Jones in Area 2?
I'll adopt my initial response as the answer.
And do you take the Fifth on that?
Yes.
And did you use a black box, a similar or the same electrical device that you had used in previous occasions at Area 2 on Andrew Wilson in order to interrogate him and to get a statement from him?
I'll adopt my initial response as the answer.
And you take the Fifth on that?
Yes.
Now, were you aware that Darrell Cannon had been taken to a secret site on the south side of Chicago and tortured with electric shock on November 2nd, 1983?
I'll adopt my initial response as my answer.
Will you take the Fifth Amendment as to that?
I do, sir.
Now, with regard to the electric shock device that you used on Andrew Wilson and many of the other suspects, did you subsequently dispose of that?
I'll adopt my initial response as my answer.
And you take the Fifth Amendment?
Yes.
Did you dispose of it by throwing it either in Lake Michigan or in the Chicago River or from your boat?
I'll adopt my initial response as the answer.
And take the Fifth Amendment?
Yes.
Now, from time to time in interrogations, you called suspects niggers, did you not?
I adopt my initial response as the answer to that question.
And you take the Fifth Amendment?
Yes.
And
My name is Darrell Cannon, and I'm a survivor of having been tortured. In my case, I was tortured by the New Wave Klan. The New Wave Klan wore badges instead of sheets. On November the 2nd, 1983 was a day that will live with me as long as I have breath in my body. Because on that particular day there, I found out that you can, in fact, terrorize a man. You can terrorize a man by taking him to an isolated area on the south side of Chicago, around Torrance, way out there, drive through a pipe, come out on the other side, which is an isolated area, taken out the car in handcuffs by 3 white detectives. During that day, at that site there, they played a game called Russian roulette on me. And the way that they played it, they didn't play it with a revolver, they played it with a shotgun. They took a shotgun while my hands was cuffed behind my back. And while I was standing out there, one of the detectives told me, and I quote, "Nigga, look around. Nobody's going to see or hear anything we do to you today. You can scream all you want, but nigga, before you leave here, you're going to tell us exactly what we want to hear." One of the other detectives said, "Go ahead, blow that nigga's head off." And he tried to force the shotgun barrel in my mouth. I wouldn't voluntarily allow him to do that, so he ended up chipping my 2 front teeth and splitting my lip and forcing the barrel of that shotgun in my mouth. And the other detective said, "Now, nigga, you're going to tell us what we want to hear." And again, I tried to tell them that I had nothing to say to them whatsoever. And that's when Peter Dignit pulled the trigger. I heard the click. They did this 3 separate times. The 3rd time that I heard that click, the hair on the back of my head stood straight up because I honestly thought he had blew my brains out. When that didn't work, they tried to hang me by my handcuffs, which was cuffed behind my back. He took electric caliper and he turned it on. And he stuck me on my genitals with that caliper. I had never in my life experienced that kind of pain then or since then. And I'm here to tell you that I looked at their faces. I didn't keep my eyes closed. I looked at their faces, and believe me, they enjoyed what they were doing. It wasn't a job. It was just fun and games. Now, I cried not because I hurt. I cried because I'm mad. I'm still mad today because of what happened to me. And I'll stay mad. Can't no one tell me to forgive, forget, or anything else, because you do not expect for people that have a badge to treat you in that manner. So on behalf of myself, Anthony, those who are still in prison, I thank you, we thank you, and please never allow injustice of this nature to go this long unchecked. Thank you.
Proposals and legislation to decrease and redirect policing and prison funds to other social goods. Proposals and legislation for independent civilian police accountability boards with power to investigate, discipline, and fire police officers and administrators. Proposals and legislation to disarm the police. Proposals to simplify the process of dissolving existing police departments. And they would also support proposals or legislation for more data transparency. Ultimately, the only way we will address oppressive policing is to abolish the police. Therefore, all of the reforms that focus on strengthening the police or morphing policing into something more invisible, but still as deadly, should be opposed. Moving on to perspective 8. Abolitionists believe that crime is mainly a consequence of the structure of society. We devote ourselves to a community change approach. We advocate public solutions to public problems, greater resources and services for all people. And that complements the last perspective, perspective 9, beautifully. Perspective 9. Abolitionists believe that only in a caring community that corporate and individual redemption can take place. We view the dominant culture as in need of more correction than a prisoner. Abolition Feminism Now illustrates that abolition isn't just a matter of closing prisons or making sure less people are going to them, but also working to change society for the better so we don't need them. Abolition often has a tendency to go far beyond just the abolition of prison, to the abolition of immigrant detention facilities and the abolition of the state and even capitalism. At its core, abolition is anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and feminist, because capitalism, racism, misogyny, queerphobia, what have you, are what keeps these systems intact. Just as Du Bois challenged the notion that slavery could be expunged as a discrete institution, leaving intact the existing political and economic frameworks, abolitionists today call into question that the prevailing assumption that mass incarceration can be effectively addressed without analyzing the root causes of the injustice and the impact of other systems of oppression, including, in the first place, global capitalism. Just as former slaves needed land or economic power, education or intellectual power, and representation in government or political power, incarcerated communities will be released from the hold of carcerality only by acquiring access to economic, intellectual, and political power. This framework resonates for abolitionist feminists because to render prisons and policing obsolete, we must also build movements demanding that society be reshaped with the goal of eliminating gender and sexual violence and their enabling of racist heteropatriarchal structures. It is simply not possible to tear down prisons but leave everything else intact, including the structural racism that links the prison to the larger society, or the heteropatriarchy and transphobia that fuels gender and sexual violence. With strategic, invisible, direct action, creative memes, media, and organized pressure on key policymakers, no new jails coalesce and amplify resistance and offer tangible public safety strategies. The NNJNYC campaign is not simply about what communities do not want, but, in the tradition of abolition feminism, is centered instead on what people need and want to be safe. The website demands $11 billion for the people. We call on the city to fund programs that actually keep us safe, reduce interpersonal conflict, and prevent our loved ones from going to jail. These programs include housing for all, repairing NYCHA and shelter conditions, expanding comprehensive community-based and culturally responsive mental health resources, funding harm reduction programs, expanding access to education, especially for those who have experienced incarceration, alleviating extreme poverty, ending mass surveillance and the extraction of wealth from communities through criminal court fines, fees, surcharges, and bail, and stopping false and illegal arrests. This is abolition feminism in practice. New York City is actively advancing the plan to build 4 new jails to replace the building on Rikers Island. Yet, through abolition's feminist lens and metrics, and accounting that extends beyond this immediate political movement, the wins are tangible. Part 3. What's missing? So, though I think abolition is a pretty solid philosophy and political stance, I think it has a few things to work out before people, are more likely to jump on. As our society stands, I'm not comfortable saying some people should be a part of the general public. And yes, this extends to people who commit anti-black violence and murders. What's the accountability process for them? And who in their right minds would volunteer themselves to engage in an accountability process with, say, the McMichaels or Rittenhouse? Though I will say it's worth pondering if these things would have even happened in an anti-capitalist abolition society. Jacob Blake would have been killed if there wasn't a broken policing system, and if there wasn't a killing, then there would have been protests, and if there weren't protests, then a 17-year-old wouldn't have showed up to protests to protect property. And if the McMichaels grew up in an environment that didn't teach them to fear black people, then who's to say they probably wouldn't have chased them out. So while I understand the jail to the meantime mindset, and I find myself leaning towards it sometimes for certain crimes, I will admit, it's worth noting that most crimes can be tackled by eliminating the root causes. Should we keep prisons solely for the dangerous few? And if so, how can we be sure we're not just saying them to commit violence against others, as we know that does happen in prison? And those are just my thoughts. Angela Davis goes in a little harder. Abolitionist feminists recognize the necessary intersection of questions raised by both anti-violence activists and abolitionists. For example, the calls for defunding the police fully reckon with the danger of having classified gender violence as a crime, like any other, leading to even larger investment in police and prisons. Or, do analysis of the way structural racism in the criminal legal system promotes transphobia also include attention to disability justice? Where is the feminist interpretive to acknowledge intersectionalities of struggles as an implicit politics and praxis in current abolitionist mobilizations? Where is the sustained political commitment to abolition and feminist anti-violence work? These are questions explored in Abolition Feminism Now, which is now required reading for this class. But in conclusion, an abolitionist praxis worth a damn is anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and feminist. Though it doesn't have all the answers, I guess it has more answers than the current prison industrial complex does. And until we have all the answers, I think centering the voices of gendered and sexual violence should be key. And some people want the person who raped or sexually assaulted them dead, and that's understandable. But abolitionists remain committed to never legitimizing the prison industrial complex, as Maureen Cobbe explains as they talk about the Larry Nassar case. For those of us who believe our justice system must be transformed, moments such as this are tests of conviction. On January 28, 2018, Larry Nassar, former national team doctor of the USA Gymnastics, was sentenced to 40 to 175 years in prison for the sexual assault of minors. This sentence was handed down from the biting words of Judge Aquilina after a week of intense, moving pre-sentencing statements from Nassar's victims. "I just signed your death warrant," she said, receiving great applause. In a truly transformative model of justice, we would not allow those harms to be shielded by powerful people or institutions. We would insist on focusing not just on individuals, but also the institutions and structures that perpetrate and foster and maintain interpersonal violence. In Nassar's case, this would indicate the administrators at the Michigan State University and USA Gymnastics who ignored all initial disclosures of a sexual assault and took no actions to stop his violent behavior. Judge Aquilina's ruling accomplished none of these aims. And there you have it, my masterclass on abolition. Hopefully if you didn't know much about abolition before this video, you know a lot more now. And if you stuck through all of this to however long this turns out being, I appreciate you. If you made it this far and you aren't subscribed, then just go ahead and do it. Clearly you enjoyed yourself. And again, if you want to support me, I have a Buy Me a Coffee account and a Patreon. That brings this video to an end, so until next time, and may your boss be chill.